So we've gone from procedural to object-oriented. We've figured out how to override methods inside of a class so that we can get exactly the kind of output that we want. And now one thing we should learn a little bit about is how to make creating objects a little more useful and a little easier. Because this whole concept here where we assign the data is a little bit annoying. Now we could really quickly fix this by creating a method. We might call it something like initialize data, and moving all of this stuff out of the main method into that procedure, into that function. So let's just say I create something called initialize data. Now I get an error because I haven't created this method yet. The nice thing is that NetBeans lets us do that. If I just click on this light bulb over here, it says, well, do you want me to create that method for you? Sure. So I click on that option, and now what I'll have is down here, it will create a brand new method called initialize data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move all of these assignments into that class, or pardon me, into that method. So I'll cut it out of there. I'm going to move it into here. And now we get a lot of errors around the scope, because obviously this menu variable was defined in here. So what we need to do is we need to define this menu item outside. And now we can initialize all this data in here. So the error I'm getting here, let me just zoom up on this. It says a non-static variable menu cannot be referenced from a static context. So what this is telling us is that our main method is static, which means it belongs to the class. But this variable up here is not static, which means it would belong to an object that was created from this main class. So what we have to do is we just have to make this a static variable, and then those error messages will go away. Okay, so now my main method is looking very clean. All I'm doing in here is initializing my data and then printing out the menu. So you can see really simply that's all this program really does. And then down here I initialize my data by doing all the tough work. Right? And so if I really care about what this initialized data method's doing, I can go in here and look at it. This is still kind of annoying, this menu zero name and all this kind of stuff. It's a lot of typing, a lot of repetition where I'm repeating this over and over again. So it would be nice if I could just simply create each menu item in one step and pass in the information that I wanted to create that item with. Luckily, there's a way to do that. Inside a class, you can create something called a constructor. Now, a constructor is something that it's a method that runs every time you create an object from a class. So it lets you set up some basic information or some basic settings for that object. And all it is a method that has exactly the same name as the class. There's a constructor. And this will run every single time you create a menu item. And it can do anything you want. Just to give you some idea of how it works, I'm just going to print out sort of like a warning statement every time this method gets run. It's going to print out creating a menu item every time we create a menu item. So if we watch to see what that looks like, it's going to change our program a little bit. So you can see it ran that constructor and printed out creating a menu item 5 times. So we've got 5 menu items. Now obviously that's not very helpful. I don't want my menu item constructor to simply print out a warning message. What I'd like to do is be able to ask my menu item to automatically set up some of the properties, some of the attributes or the member variables for my object when I create it. So for example, it'd be really nice if instead of doing all of this, I could do something like this. So what I'm doing here is I am saying, let's create a new menu item, and here's how I want you to make it. I want you to create it with a name, salt and pepper chicken wings, a description, dry, salty, and peppery, a price of $9.99, and a gluten-free attribute of true. So what I'm saying is let's create a brand new menu item with all of this information. Now our built-in menu item doesn't do that obviously just yet, but you'll notice also I'm getting an error here. And if you look closely, what it's saying is I can't find a constructor for the menu item class that takes a string, a double, and a boolean. So we need to create that. Because if you look down here, we do have a menu item constructor. This is what's being called. Every time we create a new menu item, we're running the menu item constructor. Now if we don't build our own constructor, Java will automatically just create an empty one in the background and essentially just create the object without doing anything special. But if you want to do something special, you have to customize your constructor, the thing that runs when you build the object. So I need to create a menu item constructor that will take a string, another string, a double, and a boolean. So let's go back and take a look. So what I've done is adjust my constructor so that it has 4 parameters. You'll have to remember this term parameter back from when we did our procedural programming. These are the parameters that we pass in when we call the menu item class. And now we can work with them. Now there'll be a name variable, a description variable, a price variable, and a gluten-free variable that I pass in. So when I run this, name is going to be salt and pepper chicken wings, description is going to be dry, salty, and peppery, price is going to be $9.99, and gluten-free is going to be true. That's going to be the value of these parameters. They're going to be the arguments, we call them, that we pass in. So we pass in those arguments to match these parameters, and now inside the method I can use them. I want to set the object's name equal to the name that gets passed in. Hopefully you can start to see that there's a bit of a problem here. The problem is that the names I've chosen for my parameters are the same as the names of the member variables. And so you can see I'm getting some warnings over here. The problem is that Java doesn't know which of those variables it's referring to. Although, to be fair, it actually does. It thinks it's referring to these parameters here because that's the closest match. So in scope, this name refers to this name, when actually we want this name variable here to refer to the class's name variable or the object's name variable and the object's description, because we want to change the object's name to whatever name got passed in and the object's description to whatever description got passed in. Now in order to help us tell the difference, it's really easy. All we do is we add the word this before the variable that belongs to the object. And what we're saying is, hey, for this object, I want you to change this object's name to the name that was passed in as a parameter. I want you to change this object's description to the description that got passed in as a parameter. So when you use the this identifier, you're saying the object's data. Now, you could have just gone in and changed this to a different variable to prevent confusion, but that's not a very good practice. And in fact, there's lots of built-in tools and built-in functions in NetBeans and in many programming IDEs that will automatically generate methods for you based on the names of your member variables. So they will just use exactly the same name in here, and they use this prefixing inside here. So it's really important that you get used to this and that this is the way you should be doing your programming. So when I call this method, this is going to create a new menu item with all this information in it. And what this does now is this will allow me to set up all my other menu items the same way. So I'm just going to do that right now. So now initializing my data actually only takes, well, 5 lines really. I mean, they're broken over a couple of lines, but it's really only 5 statements. I'm setting up each of the menu items, using the menu items constructor and passing in the data that that constructor needs to set up the object. And if I've done this correctly, it's going to look exactly like it did before. And there you have it. Now, it might seem ridiculous to go to all this trouble to have a program run exactly the same as it did before. But this is the difference as a programmer between, making a bicycle and making a motorcycle and then making, a really high-end automobile. It's the quality that we're talking about of your code here. So being able to do this is what we call an indicator of quality. So if you are writing code with methods broken up to take care of different jobs, if you are using classes, and if you are using constructors to simplify things, overriding your toString method, this is an indicator that you really understand the concept and that you're an excellent programmer. So this is what we want you to shoot for. So the only problem here is what happens if we want to create a new menu item, but we don't know what information we want it to have just yet, but we still want to have that new menu item. Well, now we can do something called overloading a method. Overloading is when you write 2 versions of the same method that have different parameters. Okay, so this one requires you to pass in all the information for that menu item. What if we created another menu item method that required no parameters? This would be the constructor that we would run if we didn't know anything about the menu item. And writing a constructor with no parameters is a good way to set up some of the basic information about a menu item. So what we can do is we can use this constructor as a way of setting some default information. So we might do something like this. Right, so there's some basic data about a menu item that we might use. So back in my main Java class, instead of creating this house salad, I might not be sure what my 5th menu item is yet. So I might just say, well, let's just make my 5th menu item a new menu item. So now when I run this, you'll see that this last item has some really basic information, right? It just has item name, item description, and the price is 0.0. So it's run this version of the menu item constructor because I didn't pass anything in for the parameters. It matched the way that I called it here with a blank set of parameters with the constructor that had a blank set of parameters. And when I call a constructor that has 4 parameters of a certain type, it matches it with the constructor that has those parameters. Now, a good way to do this is to have one constructor use the other constructor. I already know in here what I want for my default item name, description, blah, blah, blah. So instead of manually setting all these properties, I can go ahead and actually just call the other constructor right from within this constructor. This makes sense. I want to call my class's menu item constructor that has all of these parameters, and I've used the right name and I've passed in the right parameters, and yet I still get this weird error message. And that's because when you want to call a constructor from inside another constructor, instead of using the method name, you just use the word this. So now I should get exactly the same result for my fourth item of these default values when I run this. Now you might think, why would I bother going to the trouble of calling one constructor from inside another constructor? And it has to do with maintenance. If I have two versions of the constructor, so if I went back and had my old version of the constructor, and then suddenly I get a call from my restaurant client and they say, well, hey, whenever you create a menu item, I want you to print out the words, "This is delicious," every time you print a menu item. So I might say, okay, well, I'll go into my constructor here and I'll print out, "This is delicious." Now, this is obviously a very dumb thing to do, but if this is what the client wanted right here, we might try this. If I had two separate constructors and I was doing this the old way, like this, you can see what the problem would be. If I run this now, you'll see that it only prints out "This is delicious" 4 times, because for this item here I called a different constructor, and so this constructor did not print out "This is delicious." So I'd have to go in here, and now suddenly I've duplicated exactly the same functionality in 2 places. And this is a bad idea in programming. When it's only 2 places right next to each other, that's not so bad. But when you write large programs, you tend to be doing similar kinds of things in hundreds or even thousands of places in many different locations in your code. So you want to make sure that you try as much as possible to do similar tasks in one place. So if I'm going to be doing constructing of objects, I'd like as much as possible to kind of funnel all of the main action into one of those constructors. So the more complicated constructor should be the one that's ultimately doing all of the work. And all the other ones should simply be calling this complicated one in some way. So if I go back to my old method, doing it like this means that I'm going to just call this constructor and I only have to edit one method. And I can see all the stuff that happens in this one method, and I recognize that the other methods, the other constructors, are simply calling this one. So now when I run it, I'll see "This is delicious" 5 times. There it is there.